Samuel, and it's following along with what Jim has been preaching on the last several weeks. You'll find it in page 445 in the Pew Bible. It's 1 Samuel 17, and it kind of jumps around verses 4 through 11, 19 through 23, and then 32 through 49. A champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out of the Philistine camp. He was over 9 feet tall. He had a bronze helmet, and on his head he wore a coat of scale armor of bronze weighing 5,000 shekels, which at the bottom says is around 125 pounds. So he wore chainmail made out of bronze. So 9 feet tall, 125 pounds. On his legs he wore bronze greaves, and a bronze javelin was slung on his back. His spear shaft was like a weaver's rod, and its iron point weighed 600 shekels, around 15 pounds. His shield bearer went ahead of him. Goliath stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me. If he is able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us." Then the Philistine said, "This day I defy the ranks of Israel. Give me a man and let us fight each other." On hearing the Philistine's words, Saul and the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. They are with Saul and all the men of Israel and in the valley of Elah, fighting against the Philistines. Early in the morning, David left the flock with the shepherd, loaded up and set out as Jesse had directed. He reached the camp as the army was going out to its battle positions, shouting the war cry. Israel and the Philistines were drawing up their lines, facing each other. David left his things with the keeper of supplies, ran to the battle lines, and greeted his brothers. And as he was talking with them, Goliath, the Philistine champion from Gath, stepped out from his lines and shouted his usual defiance, and David heard it. David said to Saul, "Let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him." Saul replied, "You are not able to go out against this Philistine and fight him. You are only a boy, and he has been a fighting man from his youth." But David said to Saul, "Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and carried off the sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them. Because he had defied the armies of the living God, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of the Philistine." Saul said to David, "Go, and the Lord be with you." Then Saul dressed in his own tunic. He put a coat of armor on him and a bronze helmet on his head. David fastened on the sword over the tunic and tried walking around because he was not used to them. "I cannot go in these," he said to Saul, "because I am not used to them." So he took them off. Then he took his staff in his hand, chose 5 smooth stones from the stream, put them in the pouch of his shepherd's bag, and with his sling in his hand approached the Philistine. Meanwhile, the Philistine, with his shield bearer in front of him, kept coming closer to David. He looked David over and saw that he was only a boy, ruddy and handsome, and he despised him. He said to David, "Am I a dog that you come to me with the sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. "Come here," he said, and I'll give you your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the fields." David said to the Philistine, "You come against me with your sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will hand you over to me, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head. Today I will give you the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds of the air and the beasts of the earth, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands." As the Philistine moved closer to attack him, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet him. Reaching into his bag and taking out 3 stones, he slung it and struck the Philistine in the forehead. The stones sank into the forehead, and he fell face down to the ground. This is the word of our Lord God. Thanks be to God. So in the reading of Samuel, obviously this Philistine was incredibly large, probably 3 feet taller than Chris Riccosi, and probably my weight and Chris's combined, wearing a 125-pound chainmail and probably a 30-pound helmet, with a spear that weighed 15 pounds and, probably around an 8 or 9 foot shaft that he would hurl. So a very formidable looking opponent. And David, what they say is that he was probably, barely over 5 feet, maybe 5'3" or something like that, and, couldn't weigh as much as the chainmail that Goliath was wearing. We all know the story of David and Goliath, and, you can see it play out every day, whether it's big corporation and a small person, or, the bully and the shy kid in the schools. Our New Testament verse is going to be found in 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 1 through 13. That can be found on page 1799 in your Pew Bible. As God's fellow workers, we urge you not to receive God's grace in vain. For he says, "In the time of my favor I heard you, and in the day of salvation I helped you." I tell you, now is the time of God's favor. Now is the day of salvation. We put no stumbling blocks in anyone's path, so that our ministry will not be discredited. Rather, as servants of God, we commend ourselves in every way, in great endurance, in troubles, hardships, and distresses, in beatings, imprisonments, and riots, in hard work, sleepless nights, and hunger, in purity, understanding, patience, and kindness, in the Holy Spirit and in the sincere love, in truthful speech and in the power of God, with weapons of righteousness, in the right hand and in the left, through glory and dishonor, bad report and good report, genuine regarded as impostors, known yet regarded as unknown, dying and yet we live on, beaten and yet not killed, sorrowful yet always rejoicing, poor yet making many rich, having nothing and yet possessing everything. We have spoken freely to you, Corinthians, and opened wide our hearts to you. We are not withholding our affection from you, but you are withholding yours from us. As a fair exchange, I speak as to my children, open wide your hearts also. Say, thanks be to God. So in 2 Corinthians, Paul is just reiterating to the Corinthians, what they need to do to be ready to, do the works of the Lord. And he's talking about, having the grace of God. How do you accept the grace of vain? That seems like an odd thing for Paul to ask, don't you think? I mean, grace is grace, right? All the powers, all the effect, all the working is in God's hands and not ours. At least that is how we understand it. Our job is simple: to receive the grace. We just open up our hands and grace pours in. That's how it works, isn't it? Well, Paul has a different understanding, at least when it comes to the Corinthian church. And we have to admit this bunch is atypical when it comes to representing the church today. I mean, they were struggling to get along with one another. There were feelings of superiority. There were questionable intimate relationships and some challenging theological undergirdling at all. Nothing like any church today. What does that mean? Would this plea to not accept the grace of God in vain? The word he uses here and elsewhere, even about his own ministry, an example can be found right here, as Paul talks about in 1 Thessalonians. An example of that would be 1 Thessalonians 3:5. For this reason, when I could stand it no longer, I sent to find out about your faith. I was afraid that in some way the temper might have tempted you and our efforts might have been useless. Talking about, founding the church in Corinthian. So, kinon, which is translated as vain or empty. Don't let your faith be empty. Paul is saying to the Corinthian church, don't let the gift not bear fruit. Let there be some evidence of your faith in how you live in community, how you engage in the world around you. He isn't saying that you must earn faith. It is a gift, but it is a gift that works in you and works through you. There are signs, there is evidence, says Paul. There is fruit when faith is not empty. Accepting the gift in vain means nothing is done with it. Nothing internal, nothing external, just nothing, emptiness. Grace is transforming. Grace is fruit producing. But it is a partnership. That's the tricky part of the relationship. The giver of grace chooses to work with you rather than in spite of you. God chooses to invite you in this relationship. God chooses to invite you rather than overwhelm you. We can debate the cliche of whether God is the co-pilot or the pilot, but either way, there's a seat for you. Now it's acceptable time. Now is the day of salvation. There is no need to wait, says Paul. Effort can be explained right now. Hope can be lived. Grace can be full right now. As evidence, Paul offers his own life, not as a boast, but as a sign that grace is at work in him and through him. I mean, as we remember that Paul was Saul. Paul was against everything that was Christian and Jesus. Paul certainly would never have been one sitting there at the side, championing Jesus on, and that he's right, until he found, that he was wrong. But the road has not been easy. Grace does not make life simple or comfortable. If anything, it makes more complicated and difficult. Yet that is where grace is made full, where life is embraced, in its difficulties, in the heartaches, as well as in the joys and celebrations. In sorrow and in rejoicing, that grace is made manifest in individuals and the community of faith. When we rally around one another, when we enter into a hardship of another, when we endure, that grace abounds in us. So then how do we activate this grace? How do we ensure that we have not accepted God's great gift of grace in vain? Paul's advice was simple and enormously difficult. We open our hearts. We risk loving and being vulnerable. We open ourselves to the possibility of being hurt so that we can approach the possibility of knowing joy. We reach out to connect with another person, risking being rejected so that we can also embrace the possibilities of relationships. We share Christ maybe with words as we tell our story wrapped up in his story, but more oftenly and usually first, we share Christ by how we live in relationship with our neighbors and strangers and the loved ones. We rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. The grace in our lives is most full when it comes out in a relationship, when we open our hearts to those around us and trust in the abundance of God's grace. Grace and faith are intertwined, and the grace is given undeservedly or unearned. No matter what you've done, and yet, something good comes of it, or you're struggling and there's help there in that moment of struggle, and you're like, I don't even know this person, but it's the grace of God providing what we need. For me, my life, as a child, I was a normal child, outside playing baseball and having fun with my friends. At 3.5, I believe I drank a toxic cleaning substance. Should have died, but didn't. At 9, I had gotten some puncture wounds on my leg and got tetanus in the leg and should have lost my leg, but I didn't, even though within 4 days the one leg had swelled up 3 times the size of the other. And it was by the grace of God that, he brought me to the right people, and, they were able to heal me for, what I needed at that moment. It was by the grace of God that I found my wife. We were in band class for years. The prom was coming up my senior year. Too shy, probably, to ask someone. And an older friend who had graduated was really just hammering me to try and ask somebody to the prom. He didn't go. He regretted it. He was raised Catholic, and so I don't know. At this point, I would say God used him, to install that confidence in me in order to ask someone. And when I asked Tanya to the prom, I expected the no. So when she said yes, I questioned, what was that? Because I didn't expect the yes. I certainly didn't expect to be where I am today. So we were together. It was probably 2.5 years that we had been together, once we started going out. Her grandmother passed away. She was raised by her grandmother and was living in a mobile home by herself. We had plans of getting married, but her grandmother didn't want us to marry until after she was done college. She was going to become a nurse. Obviously, she's not a nurse. Her grandmother passed that October, and so we scheduled our wedding that close January 12th of 1991. And through that, I'm thinking, we still have plans. You can still finish school, and, we'll work on a family later. Well, it was just 2 months before we were expecting our first child at that point. And, that really set things in motion. I was going to college, at night to, do something in the law profession, paralegal or legal assistant. And, a little too difficult to maintain with working full-time. At that point, we were married. We had a home that we had to take care of together, literally not too far out of high school. And it was by the grace of God that he provided the opportunities to us to be successful in that endeavor. We grew our family to 4 children. After our 3rd daughter decided we weren't having any more. And through that grace, Tanya felt that we needed to have another child. I couldn't do anything about it at that point. I had had medical procedure taking care of that. And so nothing came of, her wishes to do, more about that. And then one day she said, remember those signs on the buses at New Jersey Transit where I was working at the time as a mechanic? And I said, yeah. She said, well, I called and signed us up to become foster parents. And next week is our first meeting. So we embarked on becoming foster parents. Our first placement was a young child named Derek. He was 3 years old, African American. And After the second day he was with us, he was a vacation placement. So that meant his foster family either couldn't take him away on vacation or chose not to. And after the third day, he wanted to call me dad and her mom, and brought tears to my eyes. Now, as a young child, I never saw myself as a father of, 4 or 5, or, even bringing kids into the home that were not our own. It was never spoken of. My father, after our second child, he's like, oh, that's it, 2 kids, you don't want any more. But something just kind of told me, no, God has plans. And if Tanya wanted another child after the second one, it wasn't a hard fight. It certainly was a struggle looking back. But the grace of the Lord provided all of our needs beyond what I could make for myself, provided the opportunity. My best efforts, without putting the Lord first, always, ended badly. They were never successful, or not truly successful. You would work hard at something and you would just barely realize that potential. But putting the Lord first, with his grace just pouring into us and, sharing that love that, God and Jesus shown for us to others and around us, everything worked. So Derek was returned to his foster home. Don't know whatever became of him. I can only hope that he found a forever home. At that point, he wasn't able to be adopted out. He was just in the system. Then several months went by. I'm working at night at New Jersey Transit. It's about 11:30 at night. And Tanya calls on the shop phone, before cell phones. And she said that she got a call from DYFS, and they had a child they needed to have a placement for. He was 10 days old in Cooper Medical Center. So she packed into the van with our 4 children and our neighbor's 2 boys, because she was watching them at the time as well at night, and drove up to Cooper Medical Center to pick up a 10-day-old baby boy. Our son Calvin, and his name was based on his initials, CAL. You're not allowed to change a foster child's name. So we just kind of adopted his initials, and it became Cal. He was the 8th child for his mother and father. We went to Walt Disney World. 3 weeks later, we had a trip planned, and DYFS said, sure, you can take this 3-week-old baby to Disney with you, no problems. Do they really know you? They had the faith that we were going to try and do right by this child, and people in that line of work definitely have a lot of faith, and the grace of God pours through them trying to find placements for these children. It opened our eyes up to things that Tanya and I really weren't raised with, racial prejudices perhaps. In Florida, a nice older couple, would look at us and say, oh, that's really great of you two to give that poor boy a home, knowing that he looked different than us. But he could have been, anybody's in the family, it didn't happen to be a foster child, but they automatically assumed that. People would say that, a woman like that should have her tubes tied. She shouldn't be able to keep having kids put into the system. And I always said, you never know what potential that child has in this world and the things that they could do, that God has their plans. Even if it is as simple as stopping somebody from stepping off a curb and getting run over, or just a kind smile to somebody that might be thinking of ending it all. So you can't challenge what God's intentions are just because the wrong person in the wrong community may have had a child. So having the faith that God was going to help us provide for that, through his grace, he made it work. He provided everything that we needed for Calvin. It took 2.5 years before we were able to adopt him. It was probably 3 months after he was in our home that they were automatically placing him in their adoption resource network, which meant they were adopting him out. The 2.5 years took, and this is, 2000 when he came to our home till 2002. We actually had to know people of color that would stand up and testify before the state that we were good people to be parents for Calvin because of the racial difference. And you would think that that's wrong, but it actually makes sense. They want you to encourage any child you bring into their home, their native heritage. Working in New Jersey Transit, I worked with many, black men. At our shop, it was a very culturally diverse shop. We had guys that would come down from Camden on the bus that worked, and asking them, if they would go ahead and sign the affidavit for us. Surprising to me that most of them all had the same saying. If it was anyone else, Bill, my answer would be no, because I was white. But knowing me through the grace of God and the grace that he had poured in me allowed me to share that love for anyone, regardless of where they came from or the type of person they were. And I didn't know this at that time. It takes years to figure this stuff out. Is God working in your life? You might not know. You might sit there and think, I'm praying. I don't hear my prayers being answered. Or you don't see things that are working in a way that you think you should receive those answers. But these men were willing to step up, and there were some pretty hardened men that I worked with at New Jersey Transit. They were convicted felons. Some of them were, ex-murderers. It doesn't, keep them from having a job like that as a mechanic. And to know that they had that same feeling that we could be a good home for him. And it's worked out, really well for Calvin. He had medical issues that we never knew about. He was born with syphilis. Didn't know that. They cured that in the first 10 days, but there were a whole boatload of other health issues that came along that. The state doesn't tell you anything, so they probably have the hope and grace that you're not going to find out. Through that grace that God gives us openly, there's a song, right? They'll know you're Christians by your love. And the grace is love. And if we share that love, the more you share it, the more openly you are about being able to share it. And God will open your hearts and he'll open your minds to being more accepting of people sharing that love with you. With the 5 kids, we ended up with 2 more a few years later, and that's kind of a longer story on its own. They were my mom's cousin's daughters. No one in her family would take them in, and when my mom's cousin called me, and I didn't know her well. I knew her as a young child, but there was an age difference between her and us, and then I just never heard from her. Well, her and her brother had ended up in that foster care system through the 1970s and 80s, and it was not a good system compared to what it is now. So she just progressed spiraling downward and done, bad decisions, and no one in her family would take the daughters in. So Tanya immediately said, come on over. And I'm like, how are we going to pay for this? We have 5 kids and a 3-bedroom rancher already. Now we're going to have 7 with 1 bathroom, 5 girls. She obviously had the faith that that's what the Lord was calling her to do, not turn someone away. And it was a blessing tenfold on our part. Our daughters have grown up, to be smart, loving, and compassionate women, hardworking. Our daughter Jessie that we adopted, my cousin, she had received many achievements and accolades while in the Marine Corps, was able to fix things that they had over in Spain, equipment that cost hundreds of millions of dollars, and after 6 years they still didn't have it working, and she was the person to fix it. God put her in the 2nd Marine Infantry Division by mistake because they were looking for someone as a satellite communications operator that, sets up the hard lines and antenna arrays, and transferred her into the 2nd Marine Division, based on her name because they were going on a deployment and they needed the best that they had. She would have never had a chance to be the best that she had if it hadn't been for God bringing her to our home and us just giving her the opportunity to become who she wanted to be. I certainly didn't guide her, hey, you need to do this. We've never guided Calvin or any of our other children where you need to do this kind of work or that. We just provided that loving environment that they needed to become who God was guiding them to become. Church on Sundays. I believe the church on Sundays with our children. We spent many years at Central United Methodist. I really went, it was for me. I needed at least an hour of quiet time where the kids weren't screaming and hollering and running around the house and asking for this and that. And so we sat near the front. We had a whole pew, and as they got older and were bringing friends, we had 2 full pews. And, they all really received valuable education and experience through, growing in Central United Methodist Church and hearing God's message every Sunday, whether they wanted to go or not. When they're young, you pack them in the car. As they become adults, obviously they're rarely sitting with us, having their own families, living in different places throughout the country. But they still text, I stopped into a church today. Just kind of needed to feel God's presence. And, it's a good thing. And they're still doing, showing that love that they learned of Christ, that God is, instilled in us and them, to other people. That's the grace of the Lord, is not knowing how you're going to finish something, but getting started with it. I think a person that kind of exemplifies that you wouldn't think of would be former President Jimmy Carter. Now, Jimmy Carter got involved with Habitat for Humanity in 1985. Through the Carter housing project, Jimmy and his wife Rosalind have physically helped build 4,300 homes. Here's a president of the United States that is not too proud to get in and do whatever needed to be done to help build homes for people that needed it, help build some type of shelter. Habitat through Humanity has touched the lives of 59 million people with homes that they've done in shelters throughout the world. And when Jimmy Carter was asked about, why he did it, he just felt that compelling feeling that God needed him to do this, that it wasn't President Jimmy Carter, but it was just Jimmy Carter from Georgia, getting there and helping one another and showing the grace of the Lord, that he had grown with. And he was building homes up until he was 95 years old, helping rebuilding apartment buildings in New York City, getting in there, ripping out, old plaster and whatnot, just doing menial tasks, but just trying to help and sharing that love and encouraging other people to come and share that love with him. And there's so many organizations and people and things. Our chicken barbecue really is spreading that love of God with everyone. It's not just chicken, right? They know that they come to Asbury. And even though the doors aren't busting, I would say that the grace that the Lord has given us, the amount of people that are so positive towards helping everyone in our community, I don't think there's a person in the community that doesn't feel that they could come to Asbury in need of something. And God would want us to help as much as we can.